There is a man in the Bible whose name most people cannot pronounce. He appears in only two passages. He has no genealogy recorded for him, no famous lineage, no celebrated tribe, no royal blood that anyone bothered to write down. He was a foreigner in a foreign city, serving in a palace that was not his own, in a culture that was not his birthplace, surrounded by men who held far more power than he did. His name is Ebed-Melech. It means in Hebrew, servant of the king. He was a Cushite, an African almost certainly from the region south of Egypt, the land the ancient world called Cush, which corresponds roughly to what is now Sudan and northern Ethiopia. He was by every measurable standard of the ancient world an outsider. Not a son of Israel, not a member of the covenant community, not a prophet, not a priest, not a soldier, not a man whose name would normally be preserved in the sacred texts of a nation. And yet in one afternoon, in one bold and compassionate decision, in one act of quiet moral courage that cost him real social and political risk, this man did what an entire royal court and an entire city full of religious professionals could not bring themselves to do. He saved the prophet Jeremiah from dying in a mud pit. That is the story. That is all of it reduced to its simplest form. But the reduction does not do it justice because the layers underneath that simple sentence, the layers of political fear, of institutional cowardice, of the specific texture of courage required to walk into the king's gate and say out loud in front of witnesses that powerful men have done something evil. Those layers are what make this story worth telling at length in the dark when the world is quiet and the mind is open. So let us begin. Let us go back not to a myth, not to a legend, but to a city in crisis in the 6th century before the Common Era, where one man woke up one morning and decided that doing nothing was no longer acceptable. Section 1. Jerusalem on the Edge. Imagine a city that knows it is dying, but refuses to say so out loud. That is Jerusalem in the final months before the Babylonian destruction, roughly 587 or 586 years before the Common Era, depending on which historical chronology you follow. The dates are approximate, but the atmosphere is not. The atmosphere is documented. The atmosphere is preserved in stone and excavation layers, in the testimony of ancient scribes, and most vividly in the book of Jeremiah himself, a man who lived every single day of this collapse and wrote about it with a raw, aching honesty that has no equal in ancient literature. To understand what is happening to Ebed-Melech, you first have to understand what is happening to the city around him. Babylon is not on the horizon. Babylon has already arrived. King Nebuchadnezzar II of Babylon, one of the most powerful military commanders the ancient world had ever produced, had already besieged Jerusalem once before. He had already taken captives back to Babylon in an earlier deportation. He had already installed a puppet king, a man named Zedekiah, as the ruler of what remained of the kingdom of Judah. Zedekiah was not a strong man. He was a man perpetually caught between pressure and paralysis, between the voice of the prophet telling him one thing and the voice of his court officials telling him another, and he never quite had the backbone to choose a side and hold it. Now in this final siege, the Babylonian army has encircled the city completely. The walls are holding, the gates are sealed, but the food supply is running out. The cisterns are running low. People in the streets of Jerusalem are dying not from swords but from starvation. The text of Jeremiah tells us this directly. Bread is almost gone. The situation inside the city walls has become desperate in a way that is difficult to fully comprehend across the distance of 26 centuries. And into this pressure cooker, the prophet Jeremiah is still speaking. That is important. That is the thing that makes Jeremiah so remarkable and so infuriating to the men in power around him. He does not go quiet when things get dangerous. He does not read the room and decide to soften his message. He does not tell people what they want to hear. He tells them what he believes is the actual truth, which in this case is this: the city cannot win. The Babylonian army is too powerful. The siege is too complete. The only path that preserves lives is surrender. This is not cowardice on Jeremiah's part. It is not defeatism. It is a theological and strategic assessment that he has been making consistently and publicly for years. He has been saying it before the siege began. He has been saying it throughout the siege. He believes with the conviction of every fiber of his being that this is what God has told him to say, that the nation's stubborn refusal to acknowledge its own failures, its idolatry, its injustice, its systematic oppression of the vulnerable has set this course in motion. And the only remaining question is how many more people will die before the rulers accept what cannot be changed. The problem is that this message sounds to the ears of Jerusalem's political leaders like treason. Think about it from their perspective for a moment. You're an official in a besieged city. Your entire population is watching you. Morale is the only currency you have left. The soldiers on the walls need to believe there is a reason to keep fighting. The civilians huddled in their homes need to believe that the gates will hold, that something is coming, that resistance means something. And into the center of this fragile, desperate attempt to maintain collective will, a prophet stands up and says, "Go out to the Babylonians. Stop resisting. Everyone who stays in this city will die by the sword, by famine, or by plague. Everyone who surrenders will live." To the officials, this is not a theological message. It is a psychological weapon aimed directly at the thing they most need to protect: the will to resist. They are not entirely wrong to feel this way. Ancient siege warfare was in significant part a psychological operation. If you could convince the population inside the walls that the situation was hopeless, you did not even need to breach the walls. The city would open from the inside. The Babylonian commanders knew this. Everyone knew this. And here is a man inside the city, and a man with spiritual influence and a large public following, saying exactly what the enemy would want the population to believe. So the court officials go to King Zedekiah. They make their case. They are insistent. They're probably afraid. Afraid of Jeremiah, afraid of the population, afraid of the Babylonians, afraid of everything all at once. And they frame their demand in the language of national security. This man is weakening the hands of the soldiers. He is draining the resolve of the people. He must be silenced. The king, being the man he is, does not stand firm. He does not protect Jeremiah. He does not remind his officials that Jeremiah has been speaking uncomfortable truths for decades, and that the pattern of ignoring those truths has brought them to exactly this place. He does the thing he always does. He steps aside. He tells the officials in words that Jeremiah records with what reads like quiet devastation. "He is in your hands, for the king can do nothing against you." The king of Jerusalem in the final days of his kingdom confesses out loud to his own officials that he is powerless to protect one unarmed man from them. And so they take Jeremiah. Section 2. The Pit. There is something about the method the officials choose that deserves very careful attention. They do not execute Jeremiah. They do not put him in a traditional prison cell. They do not publicly denounce him in the marketplace or hold a formal trial. What they choose instead is something more calculated, more deniable, and in many ways more cruel than a simple execution. They lower him into a cistern. To a modern ear, the word cistern might sound like a prison cell, or perhaps a well. Let us be specific about what a cistern was in ancient Jerusalem, because the specificity matters to the story. A cistern was a large bottle-shaped pit carved into the bedrock beneath the city, designed to collect and store rainwater in the rocky semi-arid climate of ancient Judah. Cisterns were essential infrastructure. They were cut deep into the earth, sometimes 10 to 15 feet deep, sometimes considerably more. They were plastered on the inside to prevent water from seeping back into the ground. The opening at the top was narrow, often small enough that only one person at a time could be lowered in or pulled out, by design to prevent evaporation. When not holding water, cisterns held mud. The text of Jeremiah 38 is specific on this point. It tells us that there was no water in the cistern at this time, only mud. And it tells us that when Jeremiah was lowered in by ropes, he sank into the mud. Think about what that means physically. He was not standing on solid ground. He was not sitting in a dry chamber. He was in a dark enclosed pit with mud climbing up his legs, possibly to his waist, in a posture where any shift in position could cause him to sink further. He was in a place where no one outside would hear him if he called out. He was in a place where no one was planning to come back for him. He was in a place specifically designed by the men who put him there, for him to die without the inconvenience of anyone having to actually kill him. This is the specific horror of what was done to Jeremiah. It was a murder by abandonment, a killing by looking away. It was a method that allowed the officials to tell themselves and anyone who asked that they had not executed the prophet. They had simply placed him in custody, and if the mud and the darkness and the cold and the slow failure of his body to sustain itself in that condition happened to end his life, well, that was not their doing. That was the circumstance. This is how institutional evil operates. Not always with a sword, sometimes with paperwork, sometimes with a change in administrative classification, sometimes with a decision to look away at a particular moment and a policy of not asking certain questions, and a bureaucratic language that distances the actor from the consequence. The officials of Jerusalem did not have bureaucratic paperwork, but they had a cistern and they had ropes and they had the king's tacit permission, and they had a very practiced ability to not think too hard about where the logic of their decision was leading. Now Jeremiah is in the pit. The city continues above him. The Babylonian siege continues. The king holds his fragile court. The officials conduct their affairs. The soldiers stand on the walls. People starve quietly in their homes. And at the bottom of a muddy pit somewhere beneath the palace grounds of Jerusalem, one of the greatest prophetic voices in all of human religious history is slowly being killed by silence and mud. The text does not tell us how long he was down there. It does not give us hours. It gives us a narrative sequence that moves quickly in the reading, but may have represented an agonizing passage of real time. What it tells us is that Jeremiah was in the pit, and then it tells us that someone heard. One person heard. One person out of an entire city full of people decided that what they had heard was something they could not simply fold into their day and move past. And that person was Ebed-Melech. Section 3. Enter the unexpected hero. Let us think carefully about who Ebed-Melech is before we watch him act. The text of Jeremiah 38 identifies him as Ebed-Melech the Cushite, a palace official. Some translations render his role as eunuch, which was a common designation for certain classes of royal servants in the ancient Near East. Men who served in the innermost circles of the royal household, who had access to the king and the court that most people would never have, and who occupied a social position that was simultaneously powerful and deeply constrained. Whether this designation refers to a literal physical condition or to an administrative title is a matter of scholarly debate. And for our purposes tonight, what matters most is not the specifics of his role, but the specifics of his identity. He is a Cushite. In the ancient world, the land of Cush, located to the south of Egypt, encompassing what is now Sudan and parts of Ethiopia and Eritrea, was known and respected. The Cushite people had their own kingdom, their own pharaohs, their own monumental architecture, their own sophisticated culture. In the 8th century before the Common Era, Cushite pharaohs had actually ruled Egypt itself. The 25th dynasty of Egypt was Cushite. These were not peripheral people. These were empire builders. But here in Jerusalem, Ebed-Melech is far from home. He is serving in a palace that is not his own, in a city whose God he may or may not have been raised to worship. In a court culture that was dominated by men who shared a lineage, a religious tradition, and a political identity that he did not share. He is the outsider in the room. He is the man whose foreignness is implied in every single mention of him by name. The Cushite is how the text always identifies him, as though his point of origin is important to the story, as though it is part of the meaning. And it is, because the people who do not act in this story, the officials who threw Jeremiah into the pit, the king who looked away, the religious leaders who stayed silent, the soldiers who kept their heads down, and the general population of a city in crisis who could not afford to spend political capital on one imprisoned prophet, all of those people were insiders. They were members of the covenant community. They were people who had grown up hearing the words of the Torah, who knew the name of this God, who had prayed in the temple, who had been circumcised into the tradition, who had everything in the world of religious and cultural formation that would theoretically produce moral courage. And they did nothing. The man who acts is the one with the least institutional belonging. The man who acts is the foreigner. The man who acts is the one who, in the framework of the ancient world, might have been expected to look out for himself and no one else, to keep his head down, not make waves, not draw attention to his foreignness by making bold public accusations against powerful men. That man is the one who moves. Now think about the information he is working with. Ebed-Melech has heard, probably through the complex whisper network intelligence system that always operates inside a royal court, that Jeremiah has been thrown into a cistern. He knows or can reasonably infer that the intent is for Jeremiah to die there. He knows who made this decision. He knows the level of power held by the men who made it. He knows that the king himself stood aside and allowed it to happen. He knows all of this. And then he gets up and walks to the Benjamin Gate, where the king is holding court. Section 4, the bold confrontation, the Benjamin Gate. Let us place ourselves there for a moment. It is one of the major gates of Jerusalem, one of the points where the city opens to the outside world, or in this case, one of the points where the court and the populace interface. Ancient city gates were not merely functional structures. They were civic spaces. They were where commerce happened, where legal proceedings were held, where official announcements were made, where the king and his officials would sometimes receive petitioners and conduct the business of governance. To go to the king's gate was to enter a semi-public arena where multiple people would be present, where your words would be heard not just by the king, but by the entire court assembled around him. Ebed-Melech goes to that gate. He finds King Zedekiah there, and he speaks. The text gives us the substance of what he said, and it is direct to a degree that is almost startling. He says, "My lord the king, these men have done evil in all that they did to Jeremiah the prophet, whom they have cast into the cistern. He is likely to die of hunger in the place where he is, for there is no more bread in the city." Read that again slowly. He does not hedge. He does not frame this as a concern or a question or a suggestion. He stands in the public gate in front of the king and the court, and he names the act that was done as evil. He names the men who did it. He specifies the mechanism of the harm: starvation. Because there is no bread in the besieged city, which means even if the mud does not take Jeremiah, the lack of food will. He is making an argument that is simultaneously a moral accusation and a practical analysis. And he is doing this in front of witnesses. This is the part that does not get enough credit. It would be easier. It would be so much easier to find a private moment with the king, to catch Zedekiah alone in a corridor, to whisper a concern, to phrase things softly in a way that does not put anyone publicly on the record. That is the kind of complaint that protects the complainer. That is the kind of moral action that leaves everyone with deniability. Ebed-Melech does not do that. He walks into the public gate. He speaks clearly. He calls it evil. He uses that word. Not unwise, not unfortunate, not regrettable. Evil. The Hebrew word at the root of this accusation is one that carries strong moral weight. This was not a procedural error. This was a wrong done to a human being. This was a violation of something fundamental. And Ebed-Melech says so in front of everyone. Now pause and feel the weight of what this moment costs him. He is a foreigner in a court that is under extreme stress. The men he is accusing are powerful. The man he is accusing them to is the very man who just told those men openly that he was powerless against them. The political logic of this situation offers Ebed-Melech absolutely no protection. He has no powerful ally he can appeal to. He has no tribe, no family network, no religious community that will back him. He has his position as a palace servant and the words in his mouth and whatever it is inside him that decided this was worth the risk. He stands there, and he says it anyway. And here is the thing about King Zedekiah that makes this scene almost unbearably human in its complexity. The king listens. The same man who just handed Jeremiah over to his enemies. The same man who said, "I can do nothing against you," to those officials. He now turns around and issues a direct order. He tells Ebed-Melech to take 30 men and go pull Jeremiah out of the cistern before he dies. 30 men, not one or two, 30. Scholars have noted this number as significant. Perhaps the king feared that the officials would try to stop the rescue. Perhaps he was creating a show of force large enough to make interference politically difficult. Whatever the reasoning, the king gives the order and he gives it publicly. And he gives it because one man walked up and said the right thing at the right time with the right words and the right courage to make him. One man changed the outcome. Section 5, the king's fragile permission. And we need to sit with King Zedekiah for a moment because he is one of the most psychologically interesting figures in this entire story, and his complexity is directly relevant to the lesson Ebed-Melech's life carries. Zedekiah is not a villain. He's not a man who wanted Jeremiah to die. The text, when you read it carefully and in full context, paints a picture of a king who actually had a degree of respect for Jeremiah, who consulted him privately on multiple occasions, who believed to some extent that Jeremiah was speaking real truth. There is a passage just before this one, in chapter 37, where Zedekiah calls Jeremiah for a private consultation and asks him directly, "Is there a word from God?" And Jeremiah answers him honestly, and the king does not harm him. And he actually keeps Jeremiah in a slightly less harsh form of custody than what the officials were demanding. So this is not a king who hated the prophet. This is a king who knew probably that the prophet was right. This is a king who was trapped between the advice he was receiving from powerful officials whose cooperation he needed to maintain his rule, and the voice of a man who kept saying things that made the officials furious, and that also happened to be true. When Zedekiah says, "I can do nothing against you," that is not the statement of a tyrant. That is the confession of a man who has traded away his moral independence piece by piece in exchange for political stability, and who now finds himself in a situation where he no longer possesses the authority to act on what he knows to be right, because he has spent that authority maintaining peace with people who are wrong. This is a very human condition. This is a very recognizable failure mode, the gradual erosion of moral autonomy through a long series of small compromises, each one justifiable in isolation until the day comes when you discover that you cannot protect an innocent man from your own officials because you have made yourself too dependent on those officials to challenge them. And then Ebed-Melech walks in and something happens. Perhaps it is the public nature of the accusation, the fact that Ebed-Melech has said the word evil out loud in the gate, and that word is now out there in the world and cannot be taken back. Perhaps it is the specificity of the argument, a practical point that Jeremiah will die of hunger because there is no bread, that the timeline is immediate, that this is not a theoretical injustice but an active one happening right now. Perhaps it is something in Ebed-Melech's bearing, in the directness of his words, in the moral authority that comes from a person who is genuinely unafraid because they know they are right. Whatever it is, the king responds, and this is perhaps the most important lesson embedded in this moment. For anyone who has ever felt that speaking to the powerful was pointless, even a weak king can be moved. Even a king who has surrendered most of his moral independence to the people around him still has a residual capacity to do the right thing when someone walks in and names the wrong thing clearly enough. The door of conscience is almost never entirely sealed. It may be stuck. It may be nearly impossible to open. But Ebed-Melech finds the right words in the right moment and the right public forum, and he pushes it open. Permission is granted. 30 men are assigned. The rescue begins. Section 6, Compassion in the Details. This is the part of the story that undoes me personally every time I read it. Ebed-Melech has the men, he has the authorization, he has the ropes, he knows where the cistern is. He could go directly to the cistern, lower the ropes, and pull Jeremiah out. That would be the rescue. That would be the task completed. And that would be sufficient. Instead, he stops. He goes to a storehouse under the treasury of the palace. The text says he takes old rags and worn-out cloth from there, and then he goes to the cistern. And before he lowers the ropes to Jeremiah, he lowers the rags. And he calls down into the pit, down into the dark, down to wherever Jeremiah is standing in the mud. And he says, "Put these rags and worn-out cloth between your armpits and the ropes, so that the ropes will not cut into your skin." That is the detail. That is the thing that Ebed-Melech stopped to think about in the middle of an urgent rescue mission in a city under siege with 30 men around him, and the knowledge that the same officials who threw Jeremiah into the pit are still somewhere in the palace. He stopped to think about whether the ropes would hurt. He thought about the pain. He thought about what it would feel like for a man who had already been lowered into a muddy pit and left there to die, possibly for hours or days, to then have a rope drawn tight under his arms and pulled upward through his own body weight. He thought about the skin. He thought about the chafing. He thought about the specific preventable discomfort that would come from pulling a human being out of a pit without padding. And he got rags, old rags, worn cloth, soft things, used things, things that have been softened by time and use, things that would sit gently between rope and skin without adding their own harshness to an already harsh situation. In the middle of a crisis, in a besieged city, with political enemies who might come to interfere at any moment, and with a king whose permission could theoretically be rescinded, with an urgent need to complete this task before something changes, he stopped for the rags. Ebed-Melech got the rags. I want you to think about what kind of moral imagination it takes to do that, because the rescue was the big action, the bold action, the visible action. Walking to the king's gate and naming the evil, that was the act of courage. The rags are something else. The rags are the act of seeing. They are what happens when your care for another person is not merely functional, but genuinely attentive, genuinely present to the specific humanity of the person in front of you. The rags are what happens when you do not merely want to help someone, but when you have actually thought in detail about what it is like to be them. Jeremiah was not just an abstraction to Ebed-Melech, not just a prophet whose survival was strategically important, not just a righteous cause that justified bold action. He was a man in a pit, a man in the mud, a man whose arms would hurt if the ropes were pulled too tightly. He was a specific, physically vulnerable human being, and Ebed-Melech's care for him extended all the way down to that specific physical vulnerability. Rescue plus dignity, strength plus gentleness, justice plus tenderness. This is what the fullness of compassion looks like. It is not enough to do the right thing. It is not enough to take the courageous action. The quality of the help matters. The attentiveness of the care matters. The willingness to take one extra minute to go find the rags. That is not a footnote to the story. That is the soul of the story. A Jeremiah is pulled up. He comes out of the pit alive. The mud releases him. The darkness releases him. The silence releases him. Hands reach down and hands pull, and the ropes hold and the rags protect. And Jeremiah rises back into the light of a besieged, collapsing, heartbreaking city that is still somehow the world of the living. He is out. He is alive. And the first human hands that touched him in rescue were the hands of a man who had no particular obligation to save him, a foreigner, an outsider, a man with no institutional backing, no tribal protection, no guarantee of safety, and no certainty that this act would not cost him everything. Ebed-Melech saved the prophet. Section 7, Aftermath. Truth still stands. Now here is where the story asks something difficult of us. Jeremiah was rescued. He was moved after the rescue to the courtyard of the guard, a somewhat safer and more humane place of detention. Not freedom, but not the pit. He was alive, and the text makes clear that he continued to speak, continued to be consulted by the king, continued to function as a prophet, even in custody. But the city did not change course. The officials who threw Jeremiah into the pit were still in power. The king was still the king. The siege was still the siege. The Babylonian army was still outside the walls, patient and permanent and waiting. The rescue of Jeremiah did not trigger a collective change of heart. It did not cause the officials to repent and adopt Jeremiah's message. It did not cause the city to open its gates and negotiate a surrender that might have saved thousands of lives. Jerusalem fell anyway. In the year 586 before the Common Era, the Babylonian army breached the walls of Jerusalem. They burned the temple of Solomon, one of the architectural wonders of the ancient world, the spiritual center of the entire Israelite religious tradition. They burned the palace, they burned the city. They took the survivors captive and marched them to Babylon. King Zedekiah fled, was captured, watched his sons executed in front of him, and then had his own eyes put out so that the last thing he ever saw was the death of his children. He was then taken in chains to Babylon, where he died in prison. This is how the story ends for the city. And it raises a question that honest reflection cannot avoid. What was the point of the rescue? If the rescue of Jeremiah did not change the outcome of the siege, if the political leaders remained committed to their catastrophic course regardless, if Jerusalem fell and burned and was destroyed, as Jeremiah had been predicting for decades, what did Ebed-Melech actually accomplish? This is not a trivial question. This is the question that every person who has ever done the right thing in a situation where the right thing did not change the outcome has had to ask themselves. What does righteous action mean when the system continues its catastrophic trajectory anyway? What does it mean to save one person in a city of thousands who are heading toward disaster? The answer that this story gives is not the comfortable one. It is not a story in which the right action produces the right outcome at the systemic level. Jerusalem burns whether Jeremiah is in the pit or not. The fall of the city is not prevented by this act of rescue, but Jeremiah lives, and that matters. Not because Jeremiah's life was worth more than other lives, not because prophets receive special protection that ordinary people do not. It matters because the truth that Jeremiah carried, the word that he had been speaking, the testimony that he had been called to preserve, needed to survive the destruction of Jerusalem in order to be recorded, in order to be read, in order to be sitting in your hand or playing through your headphones right now, 26 centuries later, as you lie in the dark and listen to the story of a man who was willing to be lowered into a pit rather than stop speaking the truth. Jeremiah's writings survived the destruction of Jerusalem. They were preserved through the catastrophe. They were carried into exile and transmitted across generations, and eventually became part of the scriptural canon that three of the world's great religions share. The book of Jeremiah exists. The lamentations of Jeremiah exist. The prophecies and the prayers and the raw, honest, grief-soaked cries to God that Jeremiah wrote in the worst years of his life, they exist. Because Ebed-Melech got the rags, the rescue preserved the voice, and the voice preserved the truth. And the truth crossed 26 centuries to reach tonight, to reach you, to reach this moment in the dark where someone is listening and something ancient is speaking. The fall of the city does not undo what was done in that courtyard. The flames that burn Jerusalem do not reach the rags. The truth was preserved precisely because one man decided in a city that was deciding nothing that he could not remain a bystander. Section 8. God's personal promise to Ebed-Melech. There is an epilogue to this story that is brief, easily missed, and possibly the most theologically significant element of the entire account. In Jeremiah 39:15-18, a passage that occurs within the larger narrative of Jerusalem's fall, there is a record of a message that God told Jeremiah to deliver specifically to Ebed-Melech. Not to the king, not to the city, not to the prophet's own community, to the foreigner, to the outsider, to the man who got the rags. The message is this: I will bring my words against this city for harm and not for good, and they shall be accomplished before you on that day. But I will deliver you on that day, declares the Lord, and you shall not be given into the hand of the men of whom you are afraid. For I will surely save you, and you shall not fall by the sword, but you shall have your life as a prize of war, because you have put your trust in me, declares the Lord. Read that again. Jerusalem will fall. The city will be destroyed. Everything that Jeremiah has been predicting will come true. The harm will be accomplished. The men of power, the officials, the king, the soldiers, the ordinary people who stayed in the city, their fate is bound up with the fate of Jerusalem. But Ebed-Melech will not die by the sword. God will deliver him. And the reason given is explicit. Not because he was useful, not because he was strategic, not because he saved our prophet and we are repaying the favor. The reason given is because you put your trust in me. This is the theological heart of the story, and it deserves to be heard in full because it is easy to reduce it to a simple reward narrative. Good deeds lead to divine protection, and miss what is actually being said. What is being said is that God saw Ebed-Melech in a city of thousands, in a palace full of officials and soldiers and servants and priests. God specifically named this man, this foreigner, this outsider who had no obvious claim on the covenant promises that the texts of this tradition had articulated for centuries. This man whose people were not the descendants of Abraham, not the heirs of the Sinai covenant, not the citizens of Jerusalem in any inherited or tribal sense. God saw him. God spoke about him. God made him a specific personal promise that was not made to the king or the court or the officially religious people who had the right language and the right lineage and the right institutional affiliation. The promise went to the man who acted. There is a long tradition within biblical scholarship and theology of noting that the Hebrew prophetic tradition had a surprisingly expansive understanding of who could be seen by God and who could stand in a right relationship with God. The prophets consistently challenged the assumption that right lineage automatically produced right standing. They challenged the assumption that religious ritual without justice meant anything at all. They challenged the comfortable insiders who assumed that belonging to the right group guaranteed protection while those outside the group were invisible to the divine. Ebed-Melech is one of the most vivid embodiments of this prophetic challenge. He is outside, he is other, he is foreign, and God names him by name and says, I will save you because you trusted me. The courage to act in the name of what is right, the courage to protect the vulnerable, to stand in the public gate and name the evil, to get the rags, to care about the skin. That courage is in this text recognized as an act of trust. Not merely trust in an institution or a doctrine or a tradition, but trust in the fundamental moral structure of reality. Trust that doing the right thing, even when it costs you, even when the city is burning, even when the outcome is not in your control, trust that it matters. God says, I saw it. It mattered. Section 9, the world Ebed-Melech inhabited. A deeper look at Cush and context. To fully honor this story, we need to take one more look at where Ebed-Melech came from, because the ancient kingdom of Cush deserves more than a footnote. And the land of Cush in the ancient world was a civilization of extraordinary sophistication and power. It lay south of Egypt along the Nile in the region that is now Sudan in northern Ethiopia. Its people built their own pyramids. There are actually more pyramids in Sudan today than in all of Egypt, a fact that surprises most people when they first encounter it. The Kushite pyramids are narrower, taller, more steeply angled than the Egyptian ones, but they are just as monumental, just as carefully constructed, just as expressive of a civilization that understood both engineering and the sacred. The kingdom of Cush had an on and off relationship with Egypt that stretched over millennia. At times, Egypt dominated Cush. At other times, Cush dominated Egypt. The 25th dynasty of Egypt, as mentioned earlier, was entirely Kushite. The pharaohs from Cush sat on the throne of Egypt and ruled the most powerful empire the ancient Near East had ever seen. Taharka, one of the most famous of these Kushite pharaohs, is actually mentioned in the Book of Kings, the same biblical literature that the Book of Jeremiah is part of. He tried to come to the aid of Judah when the Assyrians were threatening Jerusalem, a generation before Jeremiah's time. Cush was a real player in the geopolitics of the ancient world. So when Ebed-Melech shows up in the palace of Jerusalem as a royal servant from Cush, he is not simply a person from some peripheral unknown place. He is from a civilization that Jerusalem's own historical memory would have recognized. He may have arrived in Jerusalem through diplomatic channels, through trade, and through the complex web of ancient Near Eastern court connections that brought people from across the known world into the service of various royal houses. We do not know his full story. We do not know how he came to be in Jerusalem, how long he had been there, whether he had family back in Cush, whether he ever returned. We know only this passage, this one morning, this one act. But knowing where he came from, knowing that he carried within him the heritage of a civilization that built its own pyramids, that produced its own pharaohs, that had its own sophisticated understanding of justice and governance, and the sacred enriches our reading of what he does. He is not simply an anonymous servant who happened to be in the right place. He is a man shaped by a culture with its own deep moral tradition, who brings that shaped self into contact with a moment of crisis and responds with the fullness of who he is. The outsider who saves the prophet is not a man without a world. He is a man with a different world, and that different world produces a different kind of courage. Section 10, The Architecture of Courage. What we learn from Ebed-Melech. Let us spend some time now with the architecture of what Ebed-Melech did, not just what he did, but how he did it, because the mechanics of his moral action teach us something that abstract principle alone cannot. First, he received information and he did not normalize it. Someone told him what happened to Jeremiah, or he heard it through the court. The information arrived. And what happens in most institutional contexts when information about an injustice arrives is that the recipient goes through a process of normalization. They file it, they contextualize it, they remind themselves of everything they cannot do. They remind themselves of all the reasons this is not their problem, all the ways their involvement would be complicated, all the things they have to lose, and how little they might actually be able to change. And then they go on with their day. Ebed-Melech did not normalize it. The text does not tell us about an extended period of deliberation. It does not tell us about sleepless nights of internal wrestling. It says he heard and then he went to the king's gate. The action followed the information without a long pause for self-protection to set in. He heard and he moved. There is a lesson in that rhythm. The longer we sit with information about an injustice before acting, the more time we give the self-protective machinery inside us to build a case for inaction. The more justifications accumulate, the more reasons pile up. The window of moral urgency, the moment when our conscience is loudest and our calculations about personal cost are quietest, is often brief. Ebed-Melech seems to have moved while that window was open. Second, he named what he saw with moral precision. He did not say, "I have some concerns about recent decisions regarding the prophet Jeremiah." He did not say, "Perhaps there might be a question about the treatment of the prisoner in the cistern." He did not use administrative language that obscured the moral reality. He said, "These men have done evil." Evil, the word matters. And the precision matters. When we soften our moral language to make it more politically comfortable, we often inadvertently soften the urgency of the situation. We allow listeners to hear a concern rather than an accusation. We allow decision makers to respond with a process rather than an action. Ebed-Melech names the thing clearly, and that naming creates a different kind of demand. You cannot respond to the accusation of evil with a committee review. You can only act or refuse to act. Third, he chose the public forum. He went to the gate, not a corridor. He spoke in front of witnesses. He created an accountability structure for the king's response by making it impossible for the king to simply ignore the information privately. This was strategic moral courage. It was not merely brave. It was tactically intelligent. He understood that the king's weakness was susceptibility to social pressure, and he used that understanding to create pressure in the direction of the right action. Fourth, he did not stop at the big action, the rags. This is the fourth pillar. He completed the task with the same quality of attention that he brought to initiating it. He did not save Jeremiah heroically and then hand him off to others to finish the job. He saw the entire rescue through with care to its most granular detail. He thought about the skin. He provided for the skin. The big action and the small action received equal moral investment. This is the complete architecture of what he did. And laid out this way, it is not mysterious or superhuman. It is teachable. It is reproducible. It is available to anyone in any century, in any culture, who is willing to receive information about an injustice and not normalize it, name it clearly, choose a public forum when possible, and care about the smallest details of how help is given. Section 11. The themes that carry this story. There are four themes in this story that cut across time and culture with the force of something permanently true. The first is that moral courage often comes from unexpected places. The expected sources of moral courage in Jerusalem were the king, the priests, the military leaders, the senior prophets, the elders at the gate. These were the men with institutional authority and the public platform and the social legitimacy. These are the men who should have stood up for Jeremiah. None of them did. The man who stood up was the one no one would have predicted, the foreigner, the outsider. This pattern appears over and over in history. The people who act when everyone else does not are rarely the people you would have selected in advance as the most likely heroes. They are often people who, precisely because they are less embedded in the existing system, have less to lose by challenging it. They are often people whose outsider status gives them a clearer view of the system's failures because they are not so invested in the system's self-image that they cannot see what it is actually doing. They are often people who have cultivated, through some combination of character and circumstance, a capacity to see a human being in front of them rather than an institutional problem. The second theme is that doing right often requires accepting social cost. Ebed-Melech did not get to act anonymously. He did not get to be a quiet hero who arranged Jeremiah's rescue through back channels while maintaining good relationships with everyone. He walked to the gate and he said the words. And the words were heard. And the words meant something about what he believed and where he stood. He accepted exposure. He accepted the possibility that the officials who had thrown Jeremiah into the pit might now view him as an enemy. He accepted the risk of becoming the kind of person in the court who makes powerful people uncomfortable. There is no way to do this kind of thing without accepting that cost. And the acceptance of that cost is not incidental to the moral act. It is part of what makes it a moral act. It is easy to care about justice in the abstract. It costs nothing to hold correct beliefs in private. The act becomes moral at the point where it begins to cost you something, where you could choose the easier path and you do not. The third theme is that compassion is not extra. It is part of righteousness. The rags are not a supplement to the story of Ebed-Melech's courage. They are not a charming detail that humanizes an otherwise political drama. They are a constitutive part of what makes this act righteous rather than merely effective. Righteousness in the biblical tradition is not simply the absence of injustice or the performance of correct actions. It carries within it a quality of attentiveness to the person, an orientation toward the specific, the physical, the vulnerable, the particular. The prophets who speak of righteousness in the Hebrew Bible always include care for the widow, the orphan, the stranger, the specific physical, socially vulnerable person standing in front of you. Ebed-Melech embodies that tradition. He cares about the prophetic mission. He cares about truth. He cares about justice. And he cares about the skin on Jeremiah's arms. He cares about all of it at once. The vertical commitment to God, to truth, to righteousness, and the horizontal attention to this person, this body, this specific preventable pain are not intention. They are the same act expressed at different levels of scale. The fourth theme is that God protects those who stand for truth, even in collapsing systems. This is the promise to Ebed-Melech. The system collapsed. Jerusalem fell. The city burned. The king lost everything. The officials who threw Jeremiah into the pit, their fate is not recorded in detail, But we can infer that the general catastrophe of Jerusalem's fall swept them along with it. The city was not saved. The collapse was not reversed. But Ebed-Melech was saved. The specific man who did the specific thing was specifically seen. And the theological claim of this story is that this is not coincidence. It is not simply lucky that Ebed-Melech survived. It is something the text presents as deliberate, personal, and direct. God saw this man in this moment, in this act, and said, "You will live." In a world where collapsing systems tend to take everyone down with them, regardless of individual virtue, this is a remarkable claim. It is saying that individual moral action within a corrupt or collapsing system is not futile. It is not wasted. It is not erased by the fact that the system fails anyway. It is seen. It is counted. And it has consequences that the trajectory of the system itself cannot cancel. That is an extraordinary thing to believe. And it is the thing that this story asks us to sit with in the dark as the city burns and one man survives who got the rags. Section 12. The echo of Ebed-Melech through history. There is a reason this obscure story has generated sustained attention across centuries of commentary, from ancient rabbinical interpreters to early Christian scholars to modern theologians across multiple traditions. It is not because Ebed-Melech performed a military miracle. It is not because he built anything that survived. It is not because he founded a tradition or wrote a text or organized a movement. It is because he did something that every generation can recognize at a scale that every person, regardless of power or status, can contemplate doing themselves. He saw an injustice. He named it. He acted. He was careful in the acting. The rabbinical tradition, which preserved and transmitted these texts through centuries of its own exile and dispersion and persecution, found in Ebed-Melech a model for righteous action in adverse circumstances. Some commentators noted the parallel between Ebed-Melech, the outsider who acts while insiders remain passive, and the broader prophetic tradition's consistent insistence that right action is not the exclusive property of any group or lineage. The Gentile who acts righteously in the rabbinical framework becomes something that challenges comfortable assumptions about who is inside the circle of divine attention. Early Christian interpreters found in Ebed-Melech a prefiguration of what they understood as the expansion of God's covenant community beyond its ethnic and national boundaries. The outsider who protects the prophet of God becomes a symbol of something that would later be articulated more fully in their own tradition. African theologians and biblical scholars have found in Ebed-Melech something else, a corrective to centuries of interpretation that rendered African figures in the Bible invisible, peripheral, or merely functional. The deliberate identification of Ebed-Melech as a Cushite, his preservation by name in the sacred text, his receipt of a personal divine promise. These are not incidental. They are saying something about who is seen. They are saying something about the width of divine attention. And across all of these interpretive traditions, the rags keep appearing. Every serious engagement with this story eventually stops at the rags. The commentators notice them. The preachers cite them. The theologians find in them a principle about the quality of care that cannot be derived from any abstract statement about righteousness. You have to look at Ebed-Melech going to the storehouse. You have to watch him sort through the old cloth. You have to hear him calling down into the pit, "Put these under your arms." That detail survives 26 centuries. That detail is still being discussed by people in universities and seminaries and churches and synagogues and living rooms and podcast studios right now today, in the year of this recording. A man got rags for a prophet in a pit, and the world has not been able to forget it. See Section 13. Jeremiah and Ebed-Melech, a meditation on the relationship. The text does not tell us what Jeremiah and Ebed-Melech said to each other. It does not record the moment when Jeremiah's feet came free of the mud and his body was lifted into the air and the light returned to his face. It does not tell us whether they embraced or whether words were exchanged or whether Jeremiah simply stood there, covered in mud and exhaustion, and looked at the man who had come for him. But we can think about it. Jeremiah had been in that pit, in the dark, in the mud, in the silence, and no one had come. The court officials who had thrown him in were not coming. The king who had permitted it was not coming. The religious leaders of the city were not coming. The soldiers were not coming. Whatever community of supporters Jeremiah might have had was apparently either unable or unwilling to act. And then the rags came down. Before the rope, the rags. Before the rescue, the care for what the rescue would feel like. Before anyone pulled him up, someone thought about his arms. What does it do to a person in extremity to experience that specific quality of attention? What does it do to receive help that is not merely functional, but genuinely tender? What does it mean to discover in the lowest and most isolated moment of your life that someone thought about the ropes? We cannot know what it did to Jeremiah. We cannot hear his voice in that moment. But the book of Jeremiah contains prayers and laments and cries to God that are among the most raw and honest in all of religious literature. He is a man who did not pretend that everything was fine. He argued with God. He cursed the day of his birth. He expressed anguish without softening it for religious propriety. And somewhere in the trajectory of that life, there was a day when a man named Ebed-Melech, a Cushite, a royal servant, an outsider, stood at the edge of a pit and threw down rags and said, "Protect yourself from the rope." That day is in the book. That man is in the book. And I think in a life as hard as Jeremiah's was, it is not a small thing that someone came with rags. Section 14, the cisterns in our own time. Now here in the final turn of this meditation, we have to do the thing that good documentary storytelling always eventually requires. We have to look at ourselves, because the cistern in this story is not only an ancient water storage pit beneath the palace grounds of a city that burned 26 centuries ago. The cistern is a recurring structure in human social organization. The cistern is what happens when the powerful decide that a voice is inconvenient and that the most efficient way to handle an inconvenient voice is not to silence it dramatically, but to lower it somewhere that most people will not look and to move on. We have cisterns. They look different now. They are bureaucratic more often than they are physical. They are administrative more often than they are muddy. But the logic is the same. Put the inconvenient truth somewhere where it cannot be easily heard and wait for it to run out of resources. The whistleblower who is buried under legal process. The journalist in a country that criminalizes reporting. The community organizer whose funding is cut. The prophet. And there are people doing prophetic work right now in every country where this is being heard, whose message is uncomfortable enough that the people with power find it easier to manage the messenger than to engage with the message. Every one of those situations is a cistern, and every one of those situations is waiting for an Ebed-Melech. The question this story asks is not a comfortable one. It is not, will you remember the brave thing that a Cushite official did in Jerusalem in the 6th century? It is not, isn't it interesting what happened to Jeremiah? The question is, if you heard that someone was in the pit, what would you do with that information? Would you normalize it? Would you file it under things that are too complicated for me to address right now? Would you tell yourself that you are not powerful enough, not positioned well enough, not the right person, not in a situation where your action could actually change anything? Or would you go to the gate? And if you went to the gate, if you named the thing clearly, If you said the word evil out loud when it applied, if you organized the 30 men and got the ropes and came to the pit, would you stop for the rags? That is the question. Not just whether you would act, but whether you would act with the full quality of attention that the person in the pit deserves. Whether you would see them not just as a cause to be advanced or a problem to be solved, but as a person whose arms might hurt, whose skin is real, whose suffering in the mud has a specific texture that your care can address if you take the extra minute to go find the old cloth. That is what Ebed-Melech teaches. And it is not a teaching that requires a theological framework to receive. It is available to anyone. It is the teaching of the rags. Section 15. Closing reflection. Sleep story tone. In a city where powerful men use pits to bury truth, one man used rags to protect it. The city is gone now. Jerusalem fell and was rebuilt and fell again and was rebuilt again. The palace where Ebed-Melech served is dust. The cistern where Jeremiah was lowered is possibly somewhere beneath the layers of a city that has been occupied and excavated and rebuilt so many times that its ancient geography is more archaeology than living memory. But the story survives. The names survive. Ebed-Melech, Jeremiah, Zedekiah. The names of the officials, Shepadiah, Gedaliah, Jehukal, Pashur, men who made a decision to lower a prophet into a pit. Their names survive too, though not the way they might have hoped. They survive as the ones who did the thing that required an Ebed-Melech to undo. And Ebed-Melech survives as the one who got the rags. There is something in the grammar of this story that feels like a deliberate choice by whoever assembled these texts. The choice to record not just the rescue, but the detail. The rags did not need to be in the story. The rescue works as a story without them. You could tell it in 2 sentences. Ebed-Melech went to the king and accused the officials. The king gave him 30 men. They pulled Jeremiah out of the pit. That is the rescue. That is the fact. But the rags are in the story. They are there in the ancient text, in the verses that were copied by hand for generation after generation, preserved through the destruction of the temple and the exile in Babylon, and the return in the Second Temple period, and the Roman destruction, and the medieval manuscript tradition, and the invention of the printing press, and the digitization of Scripture, and the text-to-speech rendering that is reading these words to you right now. The rags made it through all of that, which means that the people who preserved this story understood that the rags were not a footnote. They were the point, or at least they were part of the point in a way that the people doing the preserving recognized and chose to honor. So tonight, as you settle into wherever you are listening from, your bed, your room, your city, your corner of the world that is part of this strange global nocturnal community, take this with you. The rescue happened quietly. No armies came, no fire fell from heaven, no miraculous army appeared on the horizon. A man heard something, went somewhere, said something, gathered some men, found some rags, and lowered them into a pit. That is the whole story. Sometimes the bravest faith in the world looks exactly like that. It looks like doing the quiet thing that needs to be done. It looks like naming the thing that everyone else is pretending not to see. It looks like taking the extra minute when every situation is urging you to hurry, to think about what the help will feel like for the person receiving it. It looks like seeing the skin. It looks like finding the rags. In a world full of cisterns, be the one who goes to the gate. In a world full of people who normalize the mud, be the one who goes to the storehouse. In a world that is very good at walking past pits, be the one who stops. The city may burn anyway. The fall may come regardless. The outcome of the larger system may not be in your hands. But the person in the pit is in your hands, and you can get the rags. If this story moves something in you, if the name Ebed-Melech is one you want to carry into tomorrow, share it with someone. Leave it in the comments. Let someone know that this obscure, barely mentioned, foreign-named, rag-gathering man existed and did this thing and was seen